Of all the grim economic data coming out of China these days, this is especially revealing. For decades, foreign direct investment poured into China at steadily rising rates as investors and companies looked to ride the wave of its economic boom. But it's fallen off a cliff. Last year, FDI into China fell to just $33 billion, a 30-year low. Confidence is a key ingredient in any economic success story, and right now, it's draining away from China.
Whatever the government do, it seems that the companies or basically households do not buy into the story.
People in China, whether they're in the government or in the private sector, will tell you privately they are really worried about the country's direction and its future in a way that they have not said so for 30 years.
China's problems have been blamed on many things, from the country's property crisis to the struggle to emerge from strict zero-COVID controls. But in this episode, we'll ask if there are more fundamental problems behind its crisis of confidence.
Over time, the temptation for authoritarians to exert their control and pick favorites and demand loyalty outweighs the market.
那么实际中国内部的这种情况呢，要比这个外界看到的要严重得多。
The Chinese government is at a fork. Does it try to bring those hundreds of millions of people who are still poor into the middle class?
Welcome to Business Beyond. One of the most obvious ways to see how China's economy has changed in the last few years is by looking at its growth rate. Near double-digit growth has been a fact of life in China for much of the past 2 decades, but it plunged during the COVID-19 crisis and the post-pandemic revival quickly lost steam. GDP is projected to fall to 4.6% this year, one of the lowest rates in 30 years. One particular story has loomed larger over the Chinese economy than any other in recent times.
It's property. It's all about property. China growth for years has been driven by real estate. It's a multi-decade bull market. Part of it was rational, but the last sort of 5-6 years was definitely increasingly irrational. And through COVID, plus a pretty heavy hand from Beijing, that property bubble has in effect popped.
The property crisis thrust hundreds of massively indebted companies such as Evergrande into default and towards bankruptcy. As the crisis worsened, huge swathes of society have been severely affected.
3 really key parts of the Chinese economy are getting hit: the households, the banks, and the local governments. The households, all their wealth is in property. Terrible for them. Banks, the assets and liabilities, they're all property loans. Really bad for them. And then the local governments, really important economic actor. They rely on land sales revenues to do infrastructure to pay people's salaries. And of course, land sales have cratered as well.
And the property sector collapse came as China was dealing with another crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic. China's zero-COVID policy saw Beijing exercise extremely strict controls on public and commercial life in an attempt to keep virus numbers to an absolute minimum. But unlike in most of the rest of the world, restrictions in China were not lifted until the end of 2022. And when that finally happened, it didn't turn out as well as many had been hoping for.
When everyone else came out of COVID, you had very strong positive wealth effects. Everyone's house price had gone up, all the equity markets had gone up. So you had this massive kind of wealth tailwind behind reopening. It was the complete opposite in China. Equities down, property down, and really there was nothing to fuel post-COVID spending recovery.
China's economic slump is larger and longer than just about anyone predicted. People thought China would come out of the pandemic growing relatively well, and in fact, it hasn't.
A crisis of confidence has well and truly set in. Spurring consumption in an economy low on confidence is not easy, particularly given the outsized role that the property sector had played in that regard for so long.
因为中国的消费的增长最大的引擎是房地产。房地产才是中国消费的真正引擎和发动机。那么房地产这个引擎熄火了之后才导致中国的这个消费呢陷于一个低迷的一个状态除了刚需之外，中国人就不太愿意。
There's a long-established relationship in economics between deflation and reduced consumer spending. Consumers may be discouraged to spend if they expect further price falls. And, compared with similar-sized economies, China has a worryingly dogged deflation problem. In 2021, there was a global surge of inflation amid pandemic supply chain shocks and the effects of government stimulus packages. Yet there was barely any inflation in China, and the country quickly entered a period of deflation, while economies like the US and the Eurozone economy cut their inflation rates to healthier numbers. So what's to be done? A major government stimulus package is one option. During a slump in 2015, China devalued its currency, slashed interest rates, and poured money into property and infrastructure. But Beijing has been more reluctant this time.
Xi Jinping is willing to take quite a lot of pain with the vision, with the goal in mind of having more sustainable long-term growth. So he wants the property sector to contract in a controlled manner, in theory to set China up on a more balanced growth path going forward.
Xi's plan for a controlled real estate decline appears to be part of a general reluctance to pump more money into a struggling economy.
If you look at some of the other part of the economy, fiscal revenue from land sales fell 20%, and investment fell 10% last year. So I feel if everything is falling, then it will eventually get back to the problem of whether the government has has enough resources to stimulate the economy. So it seems to me that it's a cycle that can still be turning to the downside, and at the same time there seems to be no clear plan B for the economy.
China has taken measures to stabilise the situation. They've cut interest rates, they've provided liquidity to banks, to struggling property firms and to local authorities. But nothing seems to be working.
They've done a whole variety of things. Of course, they've also tried to reassure foreign investors that China is a good place to do business and they can make money and get deals. Nevertheless, that's still not been enough.
I think it shows a very big problem because it shows that household corporate are kind of indifferent to whatever policies that are being rolled out. So, which means that the government will need to basically provide an even clearer roadmap, or maybe even a sharper U-turn to convince the market that the policies are changing.
So is there something else going on? Although Xi Jinping has been unwilling to intervene with a major stimulus package this time round, some experts say that it's his desire for the Chinese Communist Party to have total control over the country that's doing a lot of the damage.
Under President Xi, the Chinese Communist Party has sort of broken a compact they had with the Chinese people. The compact was what I call no politics, no problem. And from 1979 till around 2015, when Xi consolidated power, the Chinese Communist Party basically left average Chinese alone to do their business, to save, to invest.
The argument goes that under Xi Jinping, the Chinese Communist Party has become so authoritarian that it has compromised economic development.
Not every problem is resolved by liberalization and just allowing more market forces to work. You need some discipline, you need some order. You need some extent of intervention. But Xi Jinping really has gone too far, and I think made a challenging situation worse. And that wasn't meant to be always. It wasn't inevitable.
Longtime China watcher Scott Kennedy believes that Xi Jinping's consolidation of power within the Chinese Communist Party has made him even more controlling as the years have gone on.
And the more the problems arose, the more he went back to his strategy of control. And that's just sped up. And the pandemic really pushed those control impulses even further, the tensions with the US and the West as well. And so just about every challenge he sees, he responds with the same approach.
There are many recent examples to back up the point. When billionaire business magnate Jack Ma criticised Chinese financial regulation in October 2020, it directly led to the suspension of the IPO of his company Ant Group. A huge regulatory crackdown on various tech companies followed. The property crisis was in part prompted by the government restricting how companies could borrow. An understandable move to rein in an overheated sector, perhaps, but undoubtedly a heavy-handed one. And speaking of heavy-handed, there was also zero COVID.
And what seems to have changed over the course of COVID and Xi is the willingness to change in a positive direction. That there's more control being imposed, there's more risk aversion being felt. The party is getting much more directive, and in part because of U.S. and external behaviors, but mostly domestically, is getting much more about self-sufficiency and choosing winners and privileging the state sector over the private sector.
Such an approach has a clear impact on free enterprise.
如果你是央企这样的中央企业，那么你可能会得到这个最大限度的资源分配包括银行的这个贷款啦包括各种政策限制啦包括这个你能够做什么都会得到最大的这种支持。那么民营经济肯定是非常令人绝望的。
Many analysts say that both people and businesses have become very careful about how they spend their money in China, due to doubts over what kind of actions the government may take in the future.
North, south, east, west, center, the party controls everything. That's straight out of Xi Jinping's recent speeches. And that's not how they're going to solve things. I know that makes them feel better that they have things under control and they can have a superficial level of stability. But the reality is that just grinds people down.
China's suffering from what I call economic long COVID, that there is this residual of low energy, of fearfulness. And this shows up in people saving more in cash and liquid things than investing in durable goods or longer term investments, people responding less to stimulus packages from the government.
从现状的发展，中国发展的这个现状来看呢，确实这样的这种做法抑制了中国的这个经济增长抑制了中国经济发展的活力和动力因为控制的事情太多了管的事情太多了所以抑制了活力。
It all feeds into a wider argument that while authoritarian regimes can spur economic growth at an earlier stage of development, eventually they run out of road if control is the primary goal.
The historical record of authoritarian regimes sustaining growth is not good. Oftentimes, whether it's Orban or Erdogan or Putin, or even in Venezuela and the Chavez de Maduro, you get an initial boost of growth, but over time, the temptation for authoritarians to exert their control and pick favorites and demand loyalty outweighs the market.
It's really hard to think of an example where that type of state-led development has pushed economic growth for economies that are in the middle, trying to move up to upper middle, trying to move to higher levels.
We've seen how the rising authoritarianism of China under Xi Jinping has serious implications for the country's economy. But it raises plenty of other questions too, and one of the biggest is about the future of Taiwan. Xi has repeatedly said that the island is part of China and that China will decide its fate. His increasingly close relationship with Russian President Vladimir Putin raises a question. Could Xi see some kind of military intervention in Taiwan as a way of distracting from or changing the dynamic of China's economic difficulties?
This is a really interesting, high stakes, tough question. And I've discussed it with senior US officials. You know, they went from, oh my God, China's economy is going so well and is so big, it's a threat, to, oh my God, China's economy is going so badly, they make you want to wag the dog, do something distracting, it's a threat.
But China's level of integration into the global economy compared with Russia makes it a very different case.
China is not like Russia because of that 40-year plus record of connectivity. As a result, China has a lot to lose if there's a war in the Taiwan Strait. Not just with regard to chips from Taiwan, but it will become a global economic pariah As long as Taiwan doesn't declare independence and the rest of the world recognize that there's a de jure independent state, then the chances of war are really low. And so have to be extremely vigilant. But I think the chances of outright conflict in the Taiwan Strait are relatively small.
Yet Xi Jinping's presidency has raised questions about China's role in the world, unlike any leader of the country since Mao Zedong.
A whole part of this conversation is about how unique Xi Jinping is. So he could take a page out of Putin's book or someone else's and go in a different way. But I think at least what we know is the costs would be extremely high. He'd be rolling the dice of the Communist Party's future if he did that.
China's crisis of confidence may have other structural causes, and there is one major long-term issue which becomes more urgent by the day. The country is aging, and its population is shrinking fast. Since the 1960s, births have far outnumbered deaths in China, but since 2016 the gap has been closing, and last year China's population shrank for the first time in more than 60 years. As the population ages and less children are born, the population decline will accelerate. China is projected to have 100 million less people by 2050 and around 400 million less by 2075. A shrinking population is rarely good news for an economy that wants to grow.
The easiest way to think about Chinese long-run economic growth is to compare it to Japan and see what's similar and what's different and learn from that experience. So China and Japan are similar in that fertility is declining to below replacement rate, right? This happened to Japan in the 90s, and this was accompanied by a period of economic stagnation.
Their population is shrinking extremely rapidly. And this is a big deal for economic growth. This is a big deal for the size of their economy. This is a big deal for the balance of who's old versus young, as viewers in Germany and throughout Europe are familiar with. But this is much more extreme and rapid than even what Italy and others have seen in Europe.
With all this bad news, it may be easy to forget just how well the Chinese economy has performed on the whole over the last 40 years. It may even be the case that the country has become a victim of unfair expectations because of all that success. And it's certainly not all bad news when it comes to China's economic potential. The leadership has talked of maintaining strategic focus, which some economists interpret as trying to achieve sustainable growth by reducing the country's huge debt pile, whilst also trying to develop technological supremacy in various fields.
There are strengths in China to be recognized. I think fundamentally they have cracked the ability to do medium tech manufacturing better, cheaper than anyone else in the world without horribly underpaying their workers, because the manufacturing workers in China are reasonably well paid. And we see this in their potential dominance of electric vehicles and related industries like batteries. So there's clearly a fundamental strength there.
It is the tech sector that they are most optimistic about. And you look at some of the breakthroughs that have come through in the past year, reasonably advanced semiconductors, China's new airplane, Huawei phone now outselling Apple, the EVs, batteries, solar. You can run through a whole range of sectors where China is very rapidly catching up or leading in the world.
Yet even when assessing China's strength in tech, there are risks to be considered.
High tech is very important, and leading powers have advanced high tech in a range of areas that help their economies. On the other hand, that's not the be-all end-all. 70+% of Chinese that were born last year were born in the countryside. 2/3 of those folks will never finish high school. That's the big challenge for China's economy, helping those people become better educated, have better health care so they can become productive citizens.
If AI takes off, that's going to be great for the few highly skilled people who work in AI, but it's not going to help the hundreds of millions who need middle-class jobs very much. And that's something else that the Chinese government and the Chinese economy has to consider.
What happens to China's economy has profound implications not just for its 1.4 billion people, but for the whole world. Its economic success powered global growth for decades, and its unraveling would be equally consequential.
As much as China is dependent on the rest of the world, we are connected to China as well. And certainly if China suffers a significant economic crisis, they'll bear the biggest brunt of those challenges. But the rest of the world will feel it in a variety of ways economically.
Xi Jinping has spoken of the economic recovery being at a critical point, and there is still time for the country's leadership to rebuild trust and, crucially, confidence.
The ability of China to get back onto a higher growth path, though not as high as it once was, is still there. And maybe it is a matter of time that if the government, this party says some form of, well, we did these things specifically under the emergency of COVID, and we're not going to do it again. And people initially are doubtful, but over a few years, they stop being quite so arbitrary interventionist. Maybe trust will be reborn to some degree, and their growth rate will go up.
But such a scenario may require an ideological shift that seems ever more unlikely.
China today looks richer, stronger, healthier, and safer than ever before. They ought to be celebrating the successful rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. Instead, they're looking for conspiracies internally, externally. Everything to the leadership is glass 3/4 empty.
除此之外在目前的阶段，在现状之下，那么中国的消费不能被看好不会有一个欣欣向荣、出人意料的转折性的繁荣和发展。
2024 is the year of the dragon in China. The symbolism will not be lost on a leader who desperately needs to fire up one of the world's most important economic engines and extinguish doubts about the part he has played in its struggles. That's all from this episode of Business Beyond. And to improve what we do, we'd love to hear from you. If you have the time, please fill in the survey in the on-screen link or in the video description to tell us what you think about the show. Thanks a lot for watching, and until the next time, take care.